I've talked before on the channel about my favorite Pokemon. It's Gengar. I've pretty well known that for a long time. I've also talked about specific categories like favorite starter, Snivy, favorite legendary, Articuno. I'll throw out one more for you that I'm not sure I've said before. Favorite evolution, Espeon. Easy stuff. But something I've been wondering about lately, because I was not sure of the answer, is which Pokemon I like least. That is, out of all 1,025 Pokemon or more, if you account for form differences, what is my least favorite Pokemon? I did not know what the answer was, and I got kind of curious about it. I don't really remember why. I think there was just like some discourse somewhere about what Pokemon people like least, and yeah, I realized I didn't know my answer. And here's the thing, right? So I'm generally fond of Pokemon pretty much categorically. Obviously, I'm a fan of the series, but what I mean by that is there aren't really any that I hate. There aren't really any that I especially dislike. I don't have some burning bad feelings toward any particular Pokemon. Especially as I get older, I felt a little bit differently as a teen at times, and that will probably factor in at some points. I mean, Gen 5 started when I was a teen still, and that's going to come up a few times in this video, but these days I generally liking things and like to sort of engage with things on their own terms, as they're meant to be. So it may be that a Pokemon design doesn't appeal to me very much, but I understand what they were going for, and they still did a good job with it, and that could be a little bit trickier to weigh here. The point is, all 1,025 Pokemon, there's probably some Pokemon for everyone that they just don't like as much as the others, even if there's no particular Pokemon that they hate, and there's no particular Pokemon that I hate, but there are some that I like less than others. But I did not know which one I like least, and so I set out to find out. Let's address this up front. It is not Simisear. If you've heard of that one poll, I don't remember the circumstances around it exactly, and it's definitely multiple Pokemon generations old now, but there was that one poll somewhere that found that Simisear was the least popular Pokemon among respondents. I was always kind of surprised by that, because Simisear is not even my least favorite of these three monkeys. That's Simipour. But I can tell you right now, not one of these three gets the very last spot for me. The method here was very simple. I went to the Cave of Dragonfly's favorite Pokemon picker. What you can do is it shows you a bunch of Pokemon at once. It doesn't have to be a bunch. You can narrow it down to two. I just went for bigger batches at first. And normally what you're supposed to do is click ones that you like more than others. You can select as many as you want on a given screen. But obviously if you select all of them, you're not really making any progress toward your goal. And ultimately the idea is to narrow it down to just one Pokemon left standing by process of elimination. And if you don't know what your favorite Pokemon is, that's a way to find out. So I used the same tool and just did the exact opposite thing. I picked the Pokemon that I liked least on each screen and worked my way through the field of Pokemon. As the field of Pokemon gets smaller, you get smaller matchups, so eventually it is just head-to-head between two Pokemon. And I worked from there. There are a bunch of options on the website to filter what Pokemon you're looking at. You can filter by type, but obviously I left in every type. You can filter by generation, but obviously I left in every generation. And there are ways to filter by form as well. And I did have to think a little bit about how to deal with forms. In fact, let's jump to this one. So my thinking was, my first gut feeling thought was, I should just do it by species. There are 1,025 species of Pokemon. I should just go through all of those. Any alternative forms of a species can be considered toward that species, but the Pokemon are just broken down like that. That is not what I ended up doing, because I decided there were some forms that were worth distinguishing. And mainly here, almost exclusively here, I was thinking of regional variants. Like, I don't necessarily think about Alolan Ninetales the same way that I think about Ninetales, Cantonian Ninetales. Or, I don't know, Paldean Wooper, the same way I think about Jotonian Wooper. And even though they're the same species of Pokemon, I think they're distinct enough that they're worth considering separately. And what I ended up kind of trying to choose as a standard here was basically, if the Pokemon if a form of a Pokemon is not able to transform into the other form, then I separate them for the list. What I mean by that is, for example, there's no way that an Alolan Ninetales can turn into a Cantonian Ninetales. Even though they're different forms of the same species, once you're in one of those forms, it's locked in forever. Right? It can never turn into the other form. That I thought was a pretty good standard for when to separate forms and when not to. I did also tick the box for other alternate forms, which in hindsight I don't think I should have done. Just in case there was some case that met my standard that was covered by that. Like, I actually can't remember now whether the 3 Wormadam forms were separated by that, but that was what I was thinking of at the time. It has 3 forms. There's not a ton of difference between them, but there's some difference, and I believe that once you've evolved your Burmy into a Wormadam, you cannot change what Wormadam form you have. So I was trying to cover for that as well. Instead, I just got kind of like... My picker kind of just got flooded with Arceus and Silvally forms for the most part, and that wasn't really worthwhile. But going in, that was what I did. But I did not separate out things like Mega Evolution, Gigantamax, absolutely not. I don't really in any meaningful way think of Mega Pokemon as separate from the base Pokemon that transform into them. To me, they're just like that Pokemon Plus, they're just added on. Same goes for Gigantamax, and they definitely don't meet the standard of being unable to transform into that form. But also, I think that alternative forms, sort of like the fact of being an alternative form is something worth considering sometimes in an exercise like this, and that's why Galarian Slowking, Galarian Slowpoke is here in this image. Because something that I like, something that I look for in a different form of a Pokemon is, obviously there has to be some similarity for it to register in our brains as the same species, but I think there's like a tricky balancing act they have to do where it also has to be different enough to feel worthwhile to separate out into a different form in the first place. Make it too similar, and it kind of feels like I'm just looking at the same thing again, which is not really worthwhile, but make it too different, and yeah, then it feels like it might as well be a separate species. I've talked about this before in the context of Mega Evolution. I think somewhere in the sort of wrap-up review video of my Pokemon X playthrough last year, I compared a few different Mega forms and my thoughts on them. Again, Mega Pokemon are not looked at specifically in this video, but I remember saying at the time, like, Mega Heracross to me stands out too much from regular Heracross to the point where I just feel like I'm looking at a different Pokemon. But on the other hand, Mega Salamence doesn't stand out enough from regular Salamence to the point where I barely feel like I'm looking at a different form at all. And the reason Galarian Slowpoke is here in this image is Galarian Slowpoke is not my least favorite Pokemon, but I think it did survive for a little while in my picker because it doesn't stand out enough from regular Slowpoke for me. I think that it's just on the wrong side of that balancing act where, you know, it's only type difference from regular Slowpoke because it only has one of the 2 types that Cantonian Slowpoke has, right? Cantonian Slowpoke is water and psychic. Galarian Slowpoke is only psychic. It dropped one of the types, not a big difference, especially since I think it like hangs around near water and stuff anyway. But also, part of its body is yellow because of the berries it eats. Its brain or its head looks a little different. I don't really see much here that stands out from Cantonian Slowpoke, and I do kind of count that against Galarian Slowpoke. It does feel a little bit like a waste of time. A little bit less so because it evolves into Galarian Slowbro and Galarian Slowking, which do not have the same problem. I think those stand out pretty nicely. But it did mean that at some point, when I was presented with Galarian Slowpoke and 19 other Pokemon, I did click on Galarian Slowpoke. I forgot to say, by the way, I did record just me going through the picker. This was not intended to be a video originally. I just genuinely was curious about what my least favorite Pokemon is and decided to do it. And then I thought, well, if I'm doing it this way, I might as well record it and see if I want to do anything with that. I do have the raw footage, but I don't think it's that interesting because a lot of it is just me listing Pokemon and thinking them through on the spot. But I thought it was more worthwhile to have a little bit more of a structured talk about some of the patterns that I noticed in my own tastes and where they ultimately led me, because I do get an answer from this. I meant to say that before the stuff about forms, but we got that, we got the forms. Let's move on to one other funny acknowledgement, which is that, you know, sometimes the reason that I have an issue with Pokemon, there's going to be a lot of meta stuff here, right? I already talked about Galarian Slowpoke just doesn't stand out enough from Cantonian Slowpoke enough to me. sometimes the meta reason that I have an issue with the Pokemon design is has really nothing to do with Pokemon. And maybe that's a little bit unfair, but it kind of just is what it is, right? This is a video about my personal tastes. So Yungoos and Gumshoos, I'm going to say this once and I'm going to move on. They did both survive for a little while in my picker because of their resemblance to a certain politician, let's say. I do not believe at all that this is an intentional design choice. But I still can't unsee it whenever I look at these Pokemon, especially considering what year Sun and Moon came out. So, no fault to the Pokemon. Surely not intended by the designers. But the fact is, I do still think about that sometimes when I see them, and it does make me like them less. Then there's Quaquaval. This one kind of blurs the lines between factors that are and are not about the Pokemon. And it's a little bit like, it's a little bit weird because, like, I guess the way to say this is that how I feel about a Pokemon can change by the medium. And I guess I should back up here and say that when I consider what are my favorite and least favorite Pokemon, I'm mostly interested in the design, but also, like, competitive merit can matter. It doesn't, I skew less that way than a lot of VGC-minded people. The casual side of my brain is still a little bit stronger. I'm still a little bit more interested in the designs of the Pokemon, and also just forming memories with them and stuff, having experiences. But yeah, I can have different thoughts about different Pokemon in different media as well, because I look at this Quaquaval design right here, and I think that's kind of a cool, creative, dynamic design. But the reason Quaquaval survived a little longer in my picker is that when it's on my screen on the Nintendo Switch, to be honest, I don't really enjoy having it there, because it's got its tail all spread out, it's dancing the whole time, and I get it, that's the point of the design. It's an interesting take on a creature, but it's just too busy for me on my Switch screen. I just don't like seeing it there. It's a lot of visual noise, which, again, you know, this is where I have to sort of consider my tastes in light of what the designers were going for, because obviously a lot of visual noise is kind of the intention with Quaquaval, and it's an interesting concept for a Pokemon, and it's not my least favorite Pokemon, but it held up for a little bit in the picker because I personally am just kind of bothered whenever it's on my screen. Now let's talk about old gen bias. I forgot that this was coming up so soon. In my picker, I was biased against newer Pokemon generations to an extent, maybe less than you think. Now, I'm an old enough fan to remember Generation 1, like when that was the only gen, or when Gen 2 was just starting to be teased. My first game was Gen 2, but I knew about Pokemon earlier than that. I think. How was I biased against newer gen Pokemon? Sometimes when this discussion comes up, people say, oh, the new designs are trash, they're uninspired, there's nothing creative or interesting, and that is nonsense. I do not endorse that at all. They have cooked hard with so many Pokemon designs in every recent generation. In fact, I think if there's any Pokemon generation that kind of is a little bit filled with duds design-wise, it's Gen 5, and we'll talk about that later. But ever since Gen 6, I really think that Game Freak have rarely missed with Pokemon designs, and they've put a lot of creative and interesting ones out there. Why am I biased then against old gens? Also, if I were to make a list of like my top 30 favorite Pokemon, maybe my top 50, because, you know, I am kind of an older fan, I wouldn't be surprised if things like Chien-Pao, Chi-Yu, Walking Wake, Darkspun, Palafin showed up. There are a lot of designs from even Gen 9 that I love. The reason I was somewhat biased against older gen Pokemon some of the time, like kind of around the margins, in the least favorite Pokemon picker, is that I have had fewer opportunities to make memories with them. Simple as that. An older Pokemon, you know, I might have used it in a playthrough a long time ago. Maybe when I actually was a child, if it's an old enough one. Maybe I've done some, maybe I like Nuzlocked with it or something. Maybe I've used it in a video, although I haven't been doing this very long, right? There are just more opportunities for memories to be formed that give me some feeling of connection to the Pokemon. And you can say that's unfair, but that's just kind of how favorites work to an extent, right? Not the whole picture. Like, Chien-Pao looks awesome to me, and so does Chi-Yu, regardless of how long I've had to make memories with them, although I have taken both of them to VGC events and stuff. I really like Walking Wake as a creative take that kind of fully realizes what a Paradox Pokemon can be, independent of how new it is. But when it comes to the more sort of marginal, less interesting to me Pokemon, yeah, like Seal is a cute seal with a horn. There's not a whole lot going on there, but it's a classic Pokemon from my childhood, and I like it. Clobopus was actually the very first Pokemon that I picked on the very first screen of the picker. The first random 20 Pokemon that it showed me, the one that I selected to move on was Clobopus. And I don't dislike Clobopus, but nothing especially stands out to me about Clobopus. It's an octopus that boxes. That's kind of cool, I guess, but I don't even remember whether I caught one in my initial playthrough of Shield. I think I probably did, because I go around catching a lot of new Pokemon in an initial playthrough, but I certainly didn't train one. I don't really have any particular memory of Clobopus, and it's not a design that really grabs my attention, independent of the fact that I haven't really made any memories with it. So, Clobopus survived for a little while in the picker. On the flip side, here are a couple of other new generation Pokemon. So Sinistcha, I think, is kind of a creative enough and interesting enough design on its own merit anyway, even though it's one of the very newest Pokemon in the game, but I also have used it in official competitions and earned championship points with it. If this video is going up when I think it is, you know that Sinistcha is one of the Pokemon that got me the most points this season. So I have that memory there. Swirlix is a Pokemon that could easily have done well in the picker a year ago, at time of recording, maybe a little more than a year ago at time of uploading. But it's a Pokemon that I never thought much of for a long time. Obviously, Gen 6 is not really a very new gen anymore, but it kind of is to me. But Swirlix was one of the stars of my Pokemon X playthrough last year. At one point, I think it was like the only usable Pokemon I had left, or close enough to it, and Swirlix kind of carried the game for a significant while there. So now I have fond memories of Swirlix, and Swirlix is not going to show up on a list of my least favorites, and it's going to do better than Clobopus in an exercise like this. Then we get to the question of designs that are just kind of bland, and I got a little bit ahead of myself here. This is where I meant to talk about Seal. You often see Pokemon like Tranquil and Unfezant criticized for being kind of bland, generic, normal, and flying birds. In the 5th generation, after 4 previous generations had kind of done that already. With Pokemon like Pidgey, Hoothoot. Hoothoot's a little bit more interesting, but then you get Tailo, then you get Starly. Staraptor is awesome, but it's another normal flying early game bird. And then we get this that doesn't really have a whole lot that stands out apart from Unfezant's gender differences, and to me that's not a whole lot. Tranquil and Unfezant did okay in the picker because I'm harsher on designs that I find kind of boring for newer gens than I am for older gens. Maybe that's unfair, but I already saw it before with the older gen. I give the older gen more of a pass because at least they're doing the first generic bird Pokemon or whatever. And there's also the opportunity to form more memories, but again, Gen 5 is solidly an old gen at this point. But even so, what Unfezant and Tranquil brought to the table, I'd seen plenty of times before. And you'll notice I'm not calling out Pidove. I give Pidove a pass because it's cute. That's a factor too sometimes. Some Pokemon are just kind of too cute to, or cool looking or something, to advance very far in this picker. Why is Basculin here? Red Stripe form. Could have also put Blue Stripe. White Stripe a little bit different because it evolves. Basculin was honestly, to me, pretty boring for being the generic freshwater encounter all over the Unova region. I had seen fish Pokemon before, 4 generations worth of them, and obviously Basculin stands out in some ways. It has some particular quirks to its design, its temperament, and its form difference. But fishing in rivers in Unova, or surfing, or whatever it was, and just finding this all the time, stood out to me as a really weak spot in the design of that region because it just wasn't an interesting enough Pokemon to me to carry all of those encounters by itself. The more controversial one here might be Haxorus and really its whole evolution line. Haxorus has never really done it for me. Okay, it's a dragon. Okay, it's got tusks that look like an axe in its face. And what? Even Salamence, which is 2 generations older than Haxorus, I've always found a little bit on the boring side for a Pokemon design because it's kind of just big, cool dragon to me. Haxorus, yeah, gets less leeway because it's from a later generation than Salamence. So, it's a Pokemon that I was thinking about when it came up in my least favorite Pokemon picker. Maybe that's a little bit controversial. I don't think Tranquil is so controversial, but that's how it goes. And Gen 5 is a lot of that kind of thing. And I think... Well, I don't know to what extent it's intentional. It might just be like a byproduct of them making so many new Pokemon in Generation 5, it being the generation with the most new Pokemon, even including Gen 1. But I actually think that there's a design choice at the core of the Gen 5 kind of bland designs that I don't have a problem with, which is this is the first region based on a place other than Japan. We want it to be very far away and be kind of a separate ecosystem. Black and White are only going to have Gen 5 Pokemon encounterable during the main story. So yeah, we want... So we're populating a whole new ecosystem that we want to be completely separate and far away from the established one. So it needs to have its own cast of kind of more bland, normal creatures to fill out that world. It makes sense, right? It works for Gen 1 because, yeah, a world like this would have some Pokemon that are just rats or pigeons or something. Gen 5, they redid the same thing, basically, for a new region that they were initially keeping separate from the old. People talk about a soft reboot, but also I think just to establish that this is a bigger world with other places in it that have their own local ecosystems and stuff. It's not a bad design choice, but the fact is, looking at the individual Pokemon in a vacuum, they still don't really work for me when they're not, they just don't have a whole lot going for them, like Tranquil here, and I've seen it before. I was gonna do a neat segue to this where I said then you have, I was thinking about putting Fracture there instead of Haxorus because Fracture is just kind of the awkward teen, boring, cool dragon with tusks. Middle evolutions are pretty interesting. They're not going to show up a lot here because I think Game Freak for the most part actually does a really good job with them, but they can be tricky because they are that awkward teen stage between usually a cute first stage and a cooler or somehow more interesting last stage. And something that Game Freak, I think I've read somewhere about this being an intentional design choice that they make. They're really good about it for the most part, is they make the middle stage stand out from the other two in some way, make it visually distinct so that it holds up as its own creature and it's not just a boring transitional step. There are some that are not so good about that, like my favorite starter Pokemon is Snivy, but I think Servine is a little bit generic as a middle stage between Snivy and Serperior. I can shout out Tranquil again. I've put Quilladin here because I've always felt pretty strongly that way about Quilladin. To me, Quilladin is just like bigger, rounder Chespin, and I don't really know what it brings to the table as a design of its own. I don't know that it holds up very well on its own merit as a distinct creature from Chespin. I've called out a couple of starters here. Game Freak are usually pretty good about this with starters. Bayleaf and Quilava look awesome, and Ivysaur and Charmeleon, and they all stand out in some way from their final evolutions. Wartortle, they have Croconaw with that weird pattern on its body. They have design elements that set them apart, and it's not unheard of for people to even prefer the middle stage or those design elements that it actually loses when it's fully evolved. For me, Quilladin is just bigger, rounder Chespin. Doesn't really feel like there's much point to it. Feels like it's there because it's a starter and it just has to have a middle stage. I'm not saying that's actually what went into the design process, but that's my feeling about it looking at this one. So Quilladin survived for a little while in my picker, I think. Okay, aesthetic taste. I could have worded this a little bit differently probably, but this is about the subjectivity angle that I've been talking about for a while, where I can appreciate what goes into a design while still feeling the way that I feel about it. And the point here is that there are some Pokemon that are, I think, that I believe are good takes on a particular aesthetic or a particular reference, because that's what people tell me, and I trust that Game Freak did execute that well, but the aesthetic that they're going for is just not of much interest to me. Toxtricity and Gothitelle are good examples of this. I think both of them survived their first round in my picker. I'm sure Toxtricity is a great version of what they were going for with that design. They're just not going for something that's of any real interest to me. Same goes for Gothitelle and its evolutionary relatives. I think in the recording where I just go through the picker, the raw original recording, I also complain about Toxel being a baby Pokemon because I don't understand why they took this just like random first stage encounter from Generation 8 and decided this was going to be a baby Pokemon. Maybe I'm missing something there. But I don't understand the thought behind it. With Toxtricity, I understand the thought more. It's just not of much interest to me. Not much more to say here. One pattern that does emerge when I go through the Pokemon that I like least is that I'm not super fond most of the time of what I call awkward creatures. Now, I am not consistent about this. We'll talk about it in a second. But what I mean by that is a Pokemon where there's just something weird about it that doesn't really sit well with me when I imagine it as an animal actually living in this world and not just playing out the little bits of animation that I see on my screen. Samurott is not an amazing example, but we'll get to a better one in a bit, but it's just kind of an awkward creature to me. Like, it has kind of a weird shape. I don't really know how it goes about its day with that big shell on its head. The thing where it pulls out a shell and wields it like a sword looks kind of cool as a video game character, but it doesn't really feel very practical, or I don't know. Something about it just doesn't work for me with this creature's kind of odd body shape and whatnot. And that's a good way to describe awkward creatures. Sometimes something about it just doesn't really work for me. Again, I am not consistent about this. First of all, I love weird-looking Pokemon, and I want to draw a distinction between that and awkward creatures. Sigilyph is a super weird-looking Pokemon, and it's one of my favorites from Gen 5. But I think it works I think it works perfectly fine as an execution of what it is. Of course, Sigilyph is not especially meant to resemble a real-world believable animal, so you can look at it through a different lens. I have no problem with weird, and certainly no problem with object Pokemon. Big fan of those. I also have no problem with Archaludon, even though Archaludon is a very awkward creature. It's kind of ridiculous to think about this thing actually living in a world and interacting with its environment. Like, what does it eat, and how does it get its food? How does it sleep? Maybe there's an animation for that in the picnics or something, I don't know. But that is a very strange body shape for like anything to have and actually try to live with outside of the specific situation where you're charging up electricity and firing it at an opponent in battle. Doesn't matter. Archaludon is awesome. I love the creativity that goes into this big metal dragon bridge creature. This is not a generic dragon right here. This is a very creative take on what a dragon can be. And I love what they did with it. And even though it's an extremely awkward creature, and it's honestly kind of ridiculous for a creature if you think about it, at least as far as I can tell, does not matter. Big fan. Also, Ultra Beasts are just like categorically, I didn't even think about them until I was putting these images together, but they're just like categorically not considered under my awkward creature standard, because that's the point of them. They're supposed to be weird extra dimensional beings. Based, of course, on aliens and space invaders, as well as invasive species. It's part of the point of their designs that they're awkward creatures, so I don't have any problem with them being awkward creatures. It makes them more weird and interesting and alien, and that's great. I'm a fan. But when I talk about the kind of awkward creature that I do kind of have more of an issue with, I feel like I've probably talked about Greninja on the channel before. Now, Greninja is not one of my least favorite Pokemon, but it's like a solid middle-of-the-road Pokemon design to me. It's apparently massively popular. I say apparently. I know that it's massively popular, or at least it was for a while. Do not understand it. The design is, like, okay. The ninja angle is kind of cool. It has a tongue permanently stuck out and wrapped around its neck like a scarf, and presumably, like, interacting with, touching things all the time as it goes about its life. That was one of the very first design details I noticed when I saw it on my 3DS screen, and I kind of went, ew, that's weird. Not a fan. So, I'm not saying I dislike Greninja, but there's definitely a limit on how much I can like Greninja. And I actually can't remember whether Greninja got past its first round in my picker, but it's certainly a Pokemon that could have. And, I threw this in here. It's not really relevant, but it is something that I was thinking about as I went through it. I want to talk about humanoid starters for a second, because I brought a few of them up already. Pokemon like Samurott. Samurott's a little bit humanoid, not as hardcore as they go with them these days. And Greninja. While I'm sharing opinions about Pokemon on the internet, I am a little bit of a humanoid starter complainer, but I want to be clear, and it does affect my least favorite picker in this way. It is not about the individual Pokemon designs. I feel like this point gets strawmanned a lot when people discuss it online. Someone will complain about humanoid starters, and someone else will say, well, so what? There have always been humanoid Pokemon. Some of them are really cool. You know, you have a problem with Pokemon being humanoids? I do not. I actually really like a lot of humanoid starter designs. Individually on their own merits, Primarina is not the most humanoid. Fantastic Pokemon design. Rillaboom, really good, really solid. My problem is a lack of variety in starter designs in recent generations of Pokemon. I do not dislike that they're humanoid starters. I dislike that pretty much all of them go humanoid, more or less now. I mean, Skeledirge is a quadruped most of the time, and honestly, that's one of the reasons I picked Fuecoco as my starter in Violet, because it was kind of a breath of fresh air. And even then, it stands up and sings when it's, doing its job of being a singer, because every starter has a job now. I don't have a problem with starters like Rillaboom, Inteleon, Incineroar. I have a problem with not still getting starters like Torterra and Meganium and Swampert as well. So I'm a little bit of a humanoid starter complainer, but not in a way that is very relevant to this least favorite Pokemon picker, where I look at the Pokemon in isolation and I'm just picking the ones that I specifically like least. I'm really fond of Rillaboom. I'm really fond of Primarina. I'm really fond of Inteleon, Meowscarada, Decidueye. I do have a humanoid starter complaint. It is not relevant to this. Except Raboot. Raboot got past its first picker matchup because I don't know, maybe this is a twist on the awkward creature thing. There are other Pokemon that look like they're wearing clothes, but Raboot specifically is like too on the nose to me in terms of looking like it's wearing clothes. Despite everything that I just said about not having a problem categorically with humanoid starters, I think they overdid it with Raboot. Raboot hung around a little while in the picker. But for all those patterns and sort of concepts that I pointed out, we do have to narrow down what specifically is my least favorite Pokemon. I'm going to shout Vanillux out specifically before we get to the bottom three. So Vanillux is maybe like fourth least. It brings together some of the elements that we've talked about. I don't have a problem with Objectmon. An ice cream Pokemon is kind of a fun, whimsical concept. It's a phenomenally awkward creature. Like, it has no limbs of any use whatsoever. Two heads. I don't know. Two heads just works for me better with something like Doduo. I don't know why, but with Vanillux, it's... I don't know. Maybe it's their placement just kind of squished in next to each other where there used to be one head when it was a Vanillish. I don't know what it is, but phenomenally awkward creature. Kind of a whimsical guy. Kind of like it enough that it stays out of the bottom three. Also just kind of really ugly, though. No? Like, for such a fun, whimsical Pokemon, it's weird that it comes out looking just kind of grotesque. And the smiley face made of ice crystals on its back doesn't really do it any favors as far as I'm concerned there. So Vanillux is definitely, in my mind, one of the examples of a Gen 5 Pokemon that just didn't land right with me. But, again, not in the bottom three. So let's get to my third least favorite Pokemon, and I'm going with Trubbish. I could also put Garbodor here. I was going to say Trubbish and Garbodor, but honestly, Garbodor is saved a little bit for me by its Gigantamax form. I said that I wouldn't consider Gigantamax from Mega Form separately, but that doesn't mean I can't take them into account at all. And I actually kind of like what Gigantamax Garbodor did with the design, with the bigger bits of debris inside its body. That said, literal garbage Pokemon. And let's address the sludge mound in the room. My criticism of Trubbish and Garbodor here is not that they're boring, uncreative designs. In fact, I think that Game Freak actually did a really good job with these designs. This is perhaps the biggest instance in the whole video where we look at sort of a mismatch between the level of execution in the design and how I personally feel about it. My issue with Trubbish and Garbodor is that I find them unpleasant to look at. And people, when others criticize Trubbish and Garbodor, when older fans like me criticize Trubbish and Garbodor, they often say, well, you think a garbage Pokemon is bad and uncreative. Again, not my criticism, but not good to look at. Well, what about Grimer and Muck? They're just piles of sludge, right? And it's true. They are just piles of sludge. They are not more creative and interesting designs. In fact, I think Game Freak clipped harder with Trubbish and Garbodor. I do. But what I said here is Trubbish and Garbodor I find unpleasant to look at. And thinking this through, what I've realized is basically it's a level of familiarity. And that's what makes them stand out from Grimer and Muck in my eyes. Grimer and Muck are, to me, hypothetically disgusting creatures, right? I understand that they're supposed to be extremely toxic. They ooze everywhere. They smell bad. Ash's Muck in the anime smelled awful. And by the way, this is also a little bit me being biased in favor of older gens because I have a memory of watching Ash's Muck on TV and it was a funny guy. But also, I just don't deal with piles of toxic sludge in my day-to-day life, right? They're more hypothetically disgusting creatures to me, whereas when I see Trubbish and Garbodor, I think of something that I actually have in my home that I interact with every day and that sometimes smells foul. or just unpleasant to look at, or that I have to deal with, taking to where it has to go every couple weeks. And Trubbish and Garbodor specifically look like overflowing garbage bags. They look like something has gone wrong. They look like a mess that I'm going to have to clean up in a very realistic way that could really happen in my life. So they're more effective in sort of invoking that kind of disgust. And that's why I came to realize as I went through this that I actually think Trubbish and Garbodor are very good Pokemon designs. Game Freak set out to make a kind of a nasty, gross poison-type Pokemon, and they made one that gets that nasty, gross concept across, at least into a brain like mine, in a more real way than Grimer and Muck do, or Coughing and Wheezing, or what have you. All that said, intentionally unpleasant to look at is still unpleasant to look at, and I still don't like seeing a Grimer on my screen, because it makes me think of the garbage in my apartment that's starting to get a little bit on the smelly side right now as I record this. So Trubbish is my pick for my third least favorite Pokemon. Garbodor saved by its Gigantamax form. For my second least favorite, we're going to go in a whole different direction. One that I don't really think I can talk about with any other Pokemon. My second least favorite is Lopunny. Why do I have a problem with Lopunny? Because its design takes me out of the game. What do I mean by that? Lopunny is a Pokemon that feels to me like it doesn't fit the vibe of the rest of the Pokemon universe. Or at least the rest of the Pokemon. It's more of a meta thing, like the design choices of the Pokemon series. And such that's what I'm thinking about when I see it. Lopunny, rabbit Pokemon, great, no problem. Is pretty obviously, I think, and Bulbapedia certainly thinks so, at least in part based on a Playboy bunny. Now, I'm not very knowledgeable about Playboy, but what I know of it doesn't seem like something that I would expect to encounter as an influence in the Pokemon world ever. So whenever I see Lopunny, I'm thinking, why did they make a Playboy bunny Pokemon? That's such a weird choice. And that takes me out of the game, right? At that point, I'm not engaging with the world on its own terms. I'm thinking on a meta level, this is such a strange choice for a Pokemon design. Why was this ever used as a design inspiration in Pokemon? That's what I'm thinking about when I see Lopunny. It's also just, even though it's an older gen Pokemon, one that I haven't personally ever gotten around to training much, so I don't really have a lot of memories with it and all that. But yeah, the vibe mismatch from most of the branding and identity of the series kind of occupies my attention when I see Lopunny, and that means I'm thinking about the design and branding of the series, and I'm not immersed in the world. So that made Lopunny a pretty strong contender for my least favorite Pokemon. And I want to note, it is distinct from the Yungoos and Gumshoos thing. Yungoos and Gumshoos hung around for a little while in my picker. I do kind of find them unpleasant to look at for a different reason from Trubbish and Garbodor, but that reason is, I think, unintended. I don't think that what I see in their designs is actually what they're meant to be based on, whereas with Lopunny, I'm pretty convinced that what I see in their designs that I find odd to be encountering in the Pokemon world is actually an intentional design inspiration. I cannot for the life of me understand why. There's probably some cultural difference here that I don't know about, but yeah, it's a huge distraction from just engaging with this Pokemon design on its own terms. Like I said, it takes me out of the game because it just doesn't fit. I guess that's it. Lopunny, in my mind, just doesn't fit in the rest of this world. So with all that, you'd think it might be my least favorite Pokemon, but I did find something else. I believe Lopunny was the last Pokemon I eliminated in the picker, in the very last head-to-head matchup. But we are actually... Lopunny, I said, was kind of a unique case on this list. We are heading back now to familiar territory, to a couple of concepts that I have talked about before. The Pokemon that came out at the end of the picker, standing alone as my least favorite out of all 1,025 Pokemon. And let's pause here and remember, there is no Pokemon that I hate. Every Pokemon has something going for it. There are not even really any that I especially dislike. I just figured there probably had to be one that I liked least. And according to the favorite Pokemon picker, it's Palmo. Palmo, new generation Pokemon. Have not trained it in-game. Have I experimented with Palmet in VGC? I don't remember. If so, not much. Not much chance to form memories with it. The one memory I have of Palmo is that because it's a different color from Palmy and Palmet, I got tricked the first time I saw one in the overworld into thinking that it was shiny and started an encounter that I then promptly ran away from. Apart from being a different color, stands out from Palmet How? The Palmy line I already find not super interesting, although they have a couple things going for them. Palmy is itself kind of like a cute little rodent creature with a vague resemblance to Pikachu, which we've seen for like 7 generations in a row now. I honestly, maybe this is a cultural difference I'm not getting to, I don't know. I don't know why they keep making Pika clones. They only get less interesting to me over time. There are some that I really like, but it's not something that I'm looking for in a Pokemon generation. I'll tell you now, I have very vague concepts in like a spreadsheet somewhere in my Google Drive for a fan Pokemon region of my own creation. Actually, for 2 regions. It kind of killed time nicely during pandemic stay-at-home time, and I have not once ever thought about putting a Pika clone in either of my fan regions. So Palmy is already a little bit of a disadvantage, and it's kind of generic for a Pika clone. Like Emolga is adorable, Pachirisu is cute. A couple of others stand out for at least having a different type, which Palmy does when it's evolved, but not in its first stage. Palmet, it's bigger, it's bipedal. The main thing's going for Palmet. Okay, I understand it has that, like, what's the thing called? Why am I drawing a blank on the name of the device that they use to resuscitate people? I'll think of it later and be frustrated with myself, but it's meant to kind of resemble that. And it has Revival Blessing, which is one of the most interesting moves they've ever made in any recent generation. Fascinating new move for Pokemon. Gave Palmet a niche in VGC for a little while. So, not a big fan of Palmet, but it has some things going for it. What on earth does Palmo bring to the table? All the way back in that Quilladin image, I talked about usually Game Freak is very good about making middle stage Pokemon stand out from the rest of the family so that it doesn't seem like they're just kind of also there. I think that's something they intentionally do with a lot of their designs. Sometimes it doesn't really land with me. Palmo is perhaps the case where it lands least for me. It's just a smaller Palmet that's a lighter shade. Unless I'm missing something. That's all that I see here. And so I don't know what the point of this Pokemon is. And I think this was always kind of where we were going to end up, right? Like, Lopunny is kind of a weird case. I've actually kind of heaped praise on Trubbish while saying that nonetheless, I, relatively speaking, don't like it. But given that I don't hate any Pokemon design, I think that almost every Pokemon design brings something creative and interesting to the table and is suitable for someone's tastes. I guess we were always going to land on one where I don't see what it brings to the table. And it's just kind of boring to me, and it doesn't stand out from its own evolutionary family, much less, in this case, a category of Pokemon designs going back all the way to the beginning. So, if you clicked on this hoping that I would say, this is the Pokemon that I despise with a burning fury at the end, I'm just not that guy. My least favorite Pokemon is the one that I find has the least point to it. At least that I can see. And so the answer to the question in the title, my least favorite Pokemon is not Simisear, it's not Vanilluxe, it's not Trubbish, it's not Tranquil, it's not even Lopunny. I'm going with Palmo. And that's news to me. I don't think I would have come up with that if I just tried to think about it instead of actually doing the picker. I'll try, if I can, to link the favorite Pokemon picker in the description. You can use it to find your actual favorite or multiple favorites, because you can keep going after you've eliminated some Pokemon and make a ranked list. Or you can do what I did and do it in reverse. Or whatever you want to come up with. It's a fun little tool, and it answered a question that I've been curious about for a while, and I'm not sure that I could have answered on my own. Anyway, no hate for Palmo, but yeah, I just kind of don't really know why it's there.